We'll start the recording now. The recordings are posted to OJJDP's YouTube page as well as their multimedia page. Past webinars and past events in this series in particular are also available at OJJDP's multimedia page and their YouTube channel. If you download the handout materials for today's event, there's a link to the playlist that is available on OJJDP's YouTube page. All right, if you have any trouble accessing the event materials, you can contact the TTA Help Desk at that email there on the slide. If you do have any audio or technical issues during today's event, please just let us know in the chat and we'll help you troubleshoot through that. We do encourage questions. There will be a Q&A section towards the end of today's event, as well as a separate Q&A session that our moderator will let you know about a little later on. But please feel free to ask any questions in the chat today. We will also have a couple of poll questions, and please put your responses in the chat and make sure that you select to all panelists before hitting send. If you're viewing by yourself today, there's no need to type anything in the chat at this time, but if you are viewing as a group, please go to the chat window now and type in the number of additional people who are joining you today. And finally, you will be given a certificate of attendance for today's event. You will receive that directly from WebEx within the next 24 hours. The email is automated, so if you don't receive anything in your inbox, please check your spam folder as well. All right, and here's a general overview of today's presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Basilia.
Thanks, Alicia. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Basilia Padilla, and I am the program coordinator with the Innocent Justice Foundation's SHIFT program. So just to give a brief overview, our organization was founded back in 2007 to support ICAC teams and their affiliates, and we're funded by OJJDP, and which enables us to do these webinars for you free of charge. And we appreciate you if you have attended our previous webinars. As Alicia mentioned, you can feel free to access those if you missed them at OJJDP's website. I also wanted to mention that feel free to use the chat. As Alicia mentioned, there is some time at the end for Q&As. If we don't get an opportunity to respond to your question, we will have a separate Q&A session with some panelists, and that will be held on April 27th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I will drop that link in the chat sort of at the end of the session. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach me there. Again, this is part 5 of our webinar series, so feel free to join us for part 6, which will be on worldview, and that'll be April 20th at the same time. And we're also having some upcoming webinars in June and July, so feel free to access OJJDP's website and get more information there. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it along to our wonderful trainers, Alan and Jean, so feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Basilia, and welcome everyone. I am so grateful to be able to share time with you today and talk about this really important information that allows us to remain resilient in our work. I think some of you have seen me before. Just as a reminder, I have worked in direct service, in child protection, in intimate partner violence. I worked as a trauma-based psychotherapist for a number of years. And then I also administered the Sex Offender Management Board and the program that funds and oversees the domestic violence program in Colorado, and worked as the executive director of the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I currently have my own business, and I do training, consulting, and expert testimony related to interpersonal violence. So I've been around a long time, and I'm still feeling wonderful and happy about the work I do. So I'm sort of evidence that the tools and skills that we're teaching are really helpful and they do work. Alan, you're up.
There we go. Hi, I'm Alan Flora. Again, I think some of us have probably had classes together before at this point, but I'll do a quick recap. Started my law enforcement career in, well, technically 1991 when I went to training, and then sworn in as a deputy sheriff in January 1992. So I've been at it for a while. Was with a local sheriff's office in a rural part of North Carolina from 92 through 98. And then from 98 until my retirement in 2021, I worked with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Was a special agent there in general criminal investigation and then in fire and arson investigation. And in 2007, was fortunate enough to be selected for our computer crimes unit, where I worked with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. And I found that that was my passion, and I stayed with it, even though I'd only committed to doing 3 years. That 3 years turned into quite a few more. 2015, I was given the honor of being selected as the commander of the state task force for North Carolina, and I did that until my retirement last year. In addition to my law enforcement career and working with mostly with crimes against children in the latter half of my career, I also developed an interest in mental wellness issues, quite honestly, because I wanted to understand the effect my career was having on me. And I took a class, actually took a class from this organization in 2016, and that led to me taking a much deeper dive into it. And last year, I actually completed a master's degree in criminal justice, and my thesis delved specifically into mental wellness issues and the types of things that we'll talk about today. So I tell you that just to say that it is something I'm passionate about. And for those who haven't had a class with me yet, you're going to find that I share a lot of personal information, because that's the best way I know how to relate to you, is by sharing how these things have affected me and how I've managed it.
So just as an overview about what we're doing today, we're going to do a very brief introduction to secondary trauma and traumatic stress, and just so that you have a reminder about that and how our bodies respond to trauma and stress as we're going through the material we're teaching today. It's a way for you to make sure you connect that to what you understand about stress. And then we are going to focus in this webinar on the behavioral signs and symptoms and discuss resilience and provide tools to address specifically the behavioral signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma and chronic stress. So hopefully you'll leave with some tools to address this set of impacts that you see in your work.
And I'd like to remind you, and we do this really at the beginning of all of our presentations, to smash the stigma of discussing mental wellness issues. Talking about our feelings is important, especially when we get overwhelmed or we're feeling under-supported in our professional lives or our personal lives. So I think traditionally, especially I know for my generation, there's been a stigma about actually admitting when you're hurting or admitting that something is difficult. So we just want to knock that out of there. That's not healthy. Healthy is actually getting it out there and being comfortable talking about our feelings.
So a reminder about vicarious trauma. It is what happens to us in all the different realms of our being when we are exposed to other people's trauma on a repetitive basis over time, and we don't have the capacity to address our own distress or responses about how those things might be impacting us, because we need to focus on the child we're working with or the youthful offender that we're trying to help rehabilitate or the case that's in court. So we don't get to address our own responses. Also, just a reminder that vicarious exposure is one of the factors that is considered to cause post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what mental health people use to address impacts of trauma. So it is recognized broadly as something that causes trauma for people. And trauma is that sort of experience of an event or a series of events that are so powerful, harmful, threatening, or severe that they overwhelm our existing ability to use our coping skills. And we use what are called extraordinary coping skills, or really we move into survival-based coping. And simply, that's the fight, flight, or freeze responses that you've talked about earlier. You know that, or you will remember as I tell you that one of the things that is important to understand in our work is that freezing responses or feeling like we can't take action can cause more negative long-term impact. So the more we can focus on our work as successful fight responses or leave our work with successful flight responses, the healthier we'll be over the long time. So that's just a very brief overview of that, and a reminder that you also have those responses that are psychological in nature. So you may feel anxious, you may have distress or worry or fear, or become hypervigilant in the world, or you may tend to get more numb and feel less. And that's not helpful, even though it feels less distressing than feeling anxious or worried about things, because it is another factor that is representative of long-term negative harm. So that's just an overview for you. And we're going to move on to talk about those. When I said it impacts all the parts of us, we see that as 5 different domains that that we address. Ellen, you want to start on this one?
Well, and as you know, we're doing a series. So in our series, we're covering these different sections, and some of these you've already had, and you know, so we won't spend a lot of time reviewing those. But the thing to remember about these different domains is that we are not all affected the same way. So we may process stress differently. I may have a serious physical or cognitive reaction to this, but not necessarily change in another domain, whereas another person may react differently and have a behavioral or emotional, effect that they don't really have the effect cognitively. So today we're going to focus on behavioral, and we'll explain more about that as we go along. But I think just the key there is to remember that not everybody's going to react the same way. And the idea is to understand how vicarious trauma and how severe stress affects you so that you understand how to process it.
And the final piece about that is that line across the bottom that talked about family and friends and work and habits and communication and your sex life. That's just a reminder that these things, when they do impact you, can impact any of those components of your life or your relationships with others. They're not always the same. And this is a reminder as well about when to say when, meaning how do we tell the difference between what's normal when we're working with the really difficult cases, difficult families and children, difficult circumstances that we may be working with in our various jobs. And it's sort of normal to have those negative reactions. But when does it get to be a problem that we need to pay attention to, and when are we in trouble? And we think about that along 2 different continua. The first one is how persistent is it, or how often is it happening to us? If you find yourself periodically, for instance, getting irritable and kind of snapping at people, when you are feeling stress and trauma from work, that happens once in a while. We get overwhelmed with the distress that we're experiencing. We can be kind of short-tempered. If, however, you notice that you're doing that every day and with different people, and it starts to cause arguments or bad feelings at home or at work, you're in that warning sign area. If you find yourself picking fights with people on a regular basis, you're in the trouble indicators area. So how often are you doing it? The other thing is, how intrusive is it? So if you snap a little bit and apologize to somebody, that's very likely not going to impact your relationship with that person. If you're snarking at your kids or your spouse multiple days in a week, that might cause some conflict at home periodically. Or if you are actually picking fights or arguments with people, being really unreasonable, difficult to work with, that can impact your work life and your home life. So that's just a short review about how persistent or how intrusive is the impact you're having. And it should give you a sense that the more persistent, the more intrusive, the more you need to use your tools and skills, or to ask for help working on that impact.
So briefly, I want to review some things that I know we've covered in previous series here, but we want to kind of review again these, the compounding factors, the things that build up and really can weigh heavily on us. The number one thing we hear about is having insufficient resources. We're always, you get the old cliche about do more with less, but we hear it all the time. The job increases, the amount of cases we're dealing with increases, but the resources don't seem to come that fast. This is something that I dealt with throughout my career. And I will tell you that it was the most stressful to me when I was at the management level. When I was not a manager, I was a lot of times mad because I didn't get enough help. And why don't they care enough to get help for me? And then when I moved into the management level and I became they, I was one of the people actually responsible for getting that. That's when I realized just how hard it was. The old joke about moving at the speed of government. We would try very hard to get more positions, but at my agency, for instance, it was literally an act of our state legislature before our state agency could hire another position. They had to grant us position numbers. And the reason I mention that is, it's your perspective changes, but from whatever view I had of it, it was always frustrating when we didn't have enough people to get the job done. And we would look at this and say, well, we've got cases that aren't even getting investigated, or we're having to triage what we thought were the most important cases. And what that translates to is we're having to pick which victims need our help the most and which victims have to wait. And that sounds terrible because it is. But there's still limits to how much you can do, because if it isn't physically possible to investigate the 1,000 leads that came in the last few weeks, and that was the kind of numbers we were dealing with, then there was just that constant stress. Now, as far as what do, sometimes you have reactions to that, like, you can't concentrate, you'll get confused. Forgetfulness, low productivity. You think, well, how can you have low productivity if you have way too many cases to work? And I know for me, having too much could be overwhelming. And at times, my mind would almost just want to shut down because it couldn't process all the information. And it was too stressful sometimes to process what was really happening. Going back to what I said about having to choose, if we couldn't investigate every case, that would mean that there might be victims who weren't getting the services they need. And honestly, that was a lot to deal with. So these compounding factors are something that all of us in one way or another are dealing with. And we're going to review some more now about how to try to process and handle that.
Absolutely. And there are other things that we deal with. Often, if you're in law enforcement or the helping professions, you may find yourself having people in the general public not understanding what your job is like and what you actually have to do to get your job done. So you may feel like people are saying, well, why didn't you just fix this kid? Or why didn't you provide more help when you're dealing with those shortages that Alan's talking about? We had to get really creative when I was a psychotherapist because we had a huge demand for our trauma treatment program, but we also were tracking how we were impacted. I carried 25 individual or family clients at a time, did 3 groups, and supervised the sex assault volunteers and the SANE program in the emergency department. So then the SANE is sex assault nurse examiner program. And we realized that if we had to do 3 assessments or intakes on top of that kind of a caseload, all of us would end up being overwhelmed and traumatized by that. And we had to get creative because the hospital was demanding that we always had a time to see people. But we figured out over time that if they could write somebody's name in a slot and give them an appointment, they didn't really care if it was tomorrow or early next week when we actually had an opening. So we all put down, all of the therapists in my program put down our openings for 3 weeks out and stop them from overwhelming us. But in the moment, it can be really overwhelming. We are very often in the role of either protecting people who have been harmed or trying to keep people who have harmed other people from committing harm again. When we're talking about juvenile justice, we may be trying to rehabilitate an adolescent who maybe has done some harm, but who we think has the capacity to recover and move on. But it's a constant concern. We feel responsible for people being safe in our communities, and we care about that. That is a wonderful approach to our work, to have that caring, but it can increase your stress when that's a constant worry and thought and you have reduced resources. We might have daily contact with victims or offenders and have that distress around what they're experiencing or what they've done, their amount of remorse or lack of remorse. All of those things impact us over and over again. And it's not like we get to sort of go away, resolve, settle with what we've seen. We have to move on to the next case and the next child or the next family or the next adolescent and experience it all over again. We are also seeing in all of our caseloads increasing numbers and severity of how the offenses happen. And I think that's really difficult for people. You know, even when I started doing this work, I literally had something that ended up in a death or a homicide of someone maybe once every several hundred cases I worked on. And now that I'm doing expert testimony, and since the pandemic, that has exploded for me. And I know that that's happening at every level of our work, that the cases and the outcomes are getting more difficult and really more harmful. So it's something that it's really important we understand. One of the things that happened to me in terms of the increasing caseloads, and when I would get distressed and real severe offenses when I was working on at the University of Denver as the Title IX coordinator there, we had a young investigator who worked for me who was very bright, and he just had a baby. And one of the ways he was trying to protect himself around having this impact how he felt as a parent, having to investigate all the gender-based violence and harassment on campus, one of the investigators said, my children are going to be phoenixes and stay at home their entire college careers. And the other one decided he was going to have the best set of stupid dad jokes in the world. So every morning he would come in and tell us some new stupid dad joke. And typically it was light and funny and we had a great time. And my staff learned over time that if I wasn't getting the joke, there was something like I was over my own edge. And they got to be really good at saying to me, your sense of humor is gone. And that's an indicator that you're too stressed. What do we need to do to help support you today? And when we can do that for one another, that can make a real difference in outcomes. When we see ourselves as a team, where some of us will have more stress or more impact, and others of us will have more capacity at different times.
So some of the signs and symptoms of behavioral stress reactions that we'll talk about. So some that come to mind are like numbing. You just get numb to everything, shutting down, risk taking, drinking, substance abuse, aside from just drinking, driving fast or angry, or even more extreme stuff like extramarital affairs. And, you know, these are things that, again, not everybody reacts the same way. And you may look at somebody else having a reaction like, you know, the driving fast or angry, and you may judge them and think that's terrible. But you may have numbing or shutting down and kind of be reacting in a different way. I think for me, that the numbing, shutting down thing, that was kind of what would happen to me. If I would just get so overwhelmed, I would find that I got very little done. Because it would just be like, you know, too many cases, trying to look at all of them at one time. I couldn't focus on anything. So I think for me, the numbing and shutting down. But what we would like to do is to hear from you guys. So when we talk about some of those examples, and you can use your chat window to give us some examples of things that maybe you've experienced. And again, I would remind you, you don't see, I think, what each other put. So if you type something, the other people on the chat are not going to see the name of who typed it. But like shutting down, risk taking, drinking, substance abuse, driving fast or angry, extramarital affairs, or anything else, you know, if you've had reactions that you think that your behavior has changed, please share with us some of those.
somebody's identifying poor eating habits, and that's a really common behavioral thing. You end up sitting at your desk through lunch, or you eat at your desk, or you work so late you don't go home. Those are behaviors that impact your relationships as well as your eating. And shutting down can really cause harm in our relationships. I think that's and it's important that we talk to the people that love us about how to help us when that's happening without them just getting mad at us, that we let them know that might be something that's happening because of work and what we need to help pull us out of that. Um, some people sleep a whole lot. So that's coming up. And then we see falling sick if you're not doing adequate self-care, if you're not eating regularly, if you're not eating good food. Sometimes trauma makes us crave the fat and sugar more than anything else. So if those things are impacting your health, or you're not sleeping, the stress chemicals in our bodies can make us less resilient physically. So sometimes eating habits impact whether we get sick or not. Sleeping habits can impact that. That was a good question in the chat. And people talk about avoiding things. Sometimes when you get so overwhelmed, like Alan was talking about, I know that I remember when I was at the Sex Offender Management Board, it wasn't uncommon for me to get 250, 300 emails that I needed to respond to in a day. And then 50, 60, 70 phone calls. And I can remember a couple of times literally sitting at my desk and bursting into tears and saying, if I do nothing else today, I won't get to all this. How do I do this? So I think those things can be incredibly difficult for us, and we can start avoiding things as a way to try to protect ourselves, which is not going to address the problem, because then things just pile up more, but it's very common.
So we're getting a lot of great responses. I really appreciate you sharing and being open with us. I will say this for me, and you guys can keep asking, and I do appreciate, again, I really do appreciate you sharing. I'm going to move to the next slide, but feel free to keep putting things in the chat box. When we look about this, we think about, what is happening and like distancing from others, low motivation, the risk taking, substance abuse. This is not, the whole list, of course. This is just some examples. But I'll go back to the shutting down thing. And I think for me, that is absolutely what seems to happen. When I get overwhelmed, there's a part of me that just wants to retreat and hide. I want to literally don't want to get out of bed if it's too much, or I will find myself, as if I'm thinking about a particularly stressful thing, first of all, I'm going to have a hard time going to sleep. Sleeplessness is absolutely something that I key in with. And then when I finally do get to sleep in the following morning, I've literally found myself pulling the covers over my head, and I just want to hide from the world. Now, add to that, I'll share with you, I live in the woods and on top of a hill. This is a wonderful thing in general, but the more stressful things become, the more I find myself wanting to just hide out on top of the hill. And that might mean something as simple as I don't want to go to the grocery store. I don't want to go to the drugstore. I will find any reason not to have to run those errands just so that I can stay at home and not have to see people. I don't dislike people. Well, most people, but I do sometimes find that for me, I just want to distance from others and just kind of hide from it. And you're like, wait, aren't you the guy supposed to be telling us how to deal with this stuff? Again, I told you, I'm going to be very honest with you. We all have the feelings. So by having those feelings and learning how they affect us, that's how we can learn how to address them. And I'll switch to the next slide here, which also has some more things. And Jean, you can pick up and talk from there.
Okay. And I do want to answer one of the questions that came up in the chat, because I think it was a good one. Somebody said, I've tried to share my feelings and how I'm being impacted with my coworkers, but I feel like it might be too much for other people and they maybe don't want to hear it. And one of the things that's really important about figuring out where it's good or safe to share. You may be sharing with somebody whose coping skill is to just shut down and numb out. And if they listen to you or acknowledge that they're having feelings, they may feel like they're going to be overwhelmed by that. So it may not be about being too much, but about their coping behavior. And one of the things I've found is that when teams or colleagues do this training together or view it together, this may be something that you want to, since these are all going to be on OJJDP's website, you may want to suggest that your colleagues watch one of these or several of them as a group, or ask your supervisor to have people watch them. Because if you have the same information about the fact that it's normal to have responses and there are tools you can use to address them, and one of the best tools is social support, you may get a different response from people. But if people are just kind of out there on their own and coping, they may be shut down or numb, and it may feel overwhelming to them to hear you honestly say how you're impacted. So I find that whether you're at home or at work, having a shared agreement about how you support one another before it gets difficult can be really helpful. And some of you named all of these different things. It's really interesting. And there's a question here about generational breakdown. The impacts can be various regardless of what generation you're in. You may be not doing particular games. If gaming is your coping, you kind of check out by gaming. You may be doing different games depending on your generation, but the behavior can be the same. You may be shopping for different things or shopping online instead of in stores if you're doing excessive shopping. But those things can happen. And I had a period where the only time I felt like I didn't have to respond to something from work was if I was in a store shopping and I could tell myself, I'll call them back when I'm done. And my husband actually said to me, do you not want to be here? Because anytime you have free moment, you go out and go shopping somewhere. And so I don't get to see you at all. And it was just this sort of shock to me. So that's one of those things to remind you that we don't always notice these behaviors while they're happening. But sometimes people who care about us, sometimes our colleagues and sometimes our family members or our close friends are the first ones to see it. And instead of telling people how hard your job is and how you just need to do this, I'm asking you to see if you can be quiet and just say, what are you seeing that makes you think that? And listen, because often those people are so helpful to us in seeing those things.
You know, Gene, you touched on something too about our support networks and having agreements with how we listen and how we help each other. And it is important. I think it's good that you should be able to count on your peers and your coworkers because you understand what you're dealing with. But you do have to be careful that you're not overloading your coworkers, or you're not overloading the people to the point where they're like, I just can't deal with this today. You know, I get it, but enough is enough, you know. And then the other thing, and I think I've shared this in the previous classes, but it is worth repeating. You know, my perspective changed when I retired versus when I was the guy that, well, before I retired from law enforcement, my wife got home from work first. My wife's a school teacher. And I would come in after a stressful day and my wife would hit me with what I had missed while I was gone. And I remember thinking, you know, geez, will you just give me a minute? You know, I mean, love my wife, wonderful woman, but let me breathe. Let me put my things down. Let me do whatever, you know, before I get in the house. Give me a minute to pee, whatever it might be. Sorry, but we're all human. We get it, right? So that changed when my wife, well, when I retired and I wasn't working, you know, I'm enjoying this time, but things are still coming up and I'm still dealing with things. My wife comes in from work and I noticed that immediately as soon as she comes in, I want to start unloading about everything that happened, everything that she missed. You know, oh my gosh, let me tell you about what happened when the HVAC guy came. And you know, there came a point where my wife basically had to call me out for it and said, literally, give me time to pee, let me put my stuff down. And it was basically that. I had to see it from that different perspective. And then as soon as she called me out on it, I'm like, oh gosh, I totally understand this. I used to feel the same way. It wasn't that we didn't want to be there for each other, but we needed to give each other space and time to breathe, and time to decompress from the coming in from whatever we were dealing with to be able to hear the other. So I would say the same thing about your coworkers or whatever. There's absolutely a time that you should be there for each other, but you kind of need to have some self-awareness about whether or not you are unloading on someone who's not ready to hold that load, and whether it be a spouse or other family members, giving a person just time to settle in at home is a good thing before you attack them or unload them with everything they missed while you're gone.
Alan, that's so important. And I think one of the things we can do, again, is talk to people ahead of time when we're not in that stressful place about how to do that, about what feels supportive to us, about how is it best if I need to talk? Should I just pop in and start talking? And that's typically a no, because you don't know what they're dealing with. And one of the things you might want to do is say, I have some stuff I need to process that's kind of bothering me. Do you have time to do that now? Or could we set a time later? And then they're getting to say, I'm in the middle of this really stressful case and I need to get through what I'm doing today. Let's have coffee in the morning and I can talk to you about it. Or you plan as a team to schedule some time during your team meeting when people check in about how they're doing, and then everyone's prepared for that, but also everyone has a chance to get that kind of support. And with your spouse, being able to say out loud, like Alan did, I need a minute to debrief before I dig into what's going on here, because I'm coming home with a lot of stress from my job. I want to be present for you, but I need to do it this way. I came home one day after a particularly bad cross-examination from a defense attorney in a case and just said, it was really awful. Court was really awful today. And so my husband, trying to help as a fixer, started saying, so what did you do? Did you tell them this? Did you answer this way? What did you do about this? And I remember looking at him and saying, you know what? You're feeling like the defense attorney, not like my husband. And he said, I'm just trying to help. And I said, if you want to help me, get me a glass of wine and go turn on the fire pit in the backyard so we can go sit outside and watch the birds. I don't want to talk about the defense attorney anymore. And he was like, I can do that. But he said, why didn't you tell me that before? And I said, we make assumptions that people will know what we need. They don't always. Sometimes we have to talk about it and let them know. And that's an important piece.
Yeah. And Gene, to your point about the husband being the fixer, and I've been guilty of that many times, where my wife would talk about a stressful situation and I would immediately start asking questions, trying to say, well, did you do this? Or you should have said that. And again, that was one of those times where she had to explain to me, you're not helping, but here's the thing. I found that I had to learn, and every now and then I have to relearn, to listen, just to do active listening. But what I have found is that actually, if I was trying to, I don't want to say debate it, but really if I was trying to get into, well, you should have said this or they should have done whatever and trying to fix it, that actually just kind of raised the stress level for both of us. But I found that when I can actively listen and resist the urge to express my view on what one should have said, I find it actually it's a good venting process for her, but it also kind of relaxes me too, because I feel the tension lowering. When I can sense that when I'm just listening and she's venting it, just listening, I feel her stress level go down, and then that actually lowers mine too instead of pumping it up. So on that note, why don't you cover some stress reduction tools?
Yeah, I think that is really important. Some of the things that you can think about are, which people have you talked to who you feel good about how they respond? or do you say ahead of time, are you someone we can talk about the stress of the job? If somebody has responded negatively to you and you've checked in to make sure it wasn't because you just dumped something on them without asking, but they really are not much interested in doing that. Maybe they're not ready to start working on their own secondary trauma, or maybe they have something really awful going on at home that you don't know about, and their bandwidth is really narrow. They don't have the energy to respond. Think about people who have responded positively and think about checking in with those people more often. Notice people's responses and figure out where you do that. Who can you trust to be kind of present and actively listen for you? And who are people that it doesn't make sense to try to talk to? There was a colleague of mine that would often come to talk about his stress around things. And I remember one time thinking I would go to him. So I went to him to talk about something. And his response was to try to one up me about how difficult his cases were. And I learned real quickly that I didn't want to talk to him when I was stressed because I was just going to hear some more graphic material about really difficult cases. And that wasn't helpful to me. And I still have a good relationship with him around other things, but he's not someone I would ever try to talk to about my stress responses because the way he responds is to try to say, well, my stress is bigger than your stress. And that is not helpful. When we identify what our stress, which kind of stress affects us, we are often able to build in help kind of proactively. Like I learned through my career, I can pretty much handle any kind of case material that is related directly to humans, even little tiny children. But when I hear case material about an animal getting hurt, because I haven't had to do that as often, I don't have coping skills to deal with that. And I know that if that's the kind of case I'm getting, I need to arrange to debrief with somebody or talk to someone, or that's going to follow me around, keep me awake at night, all the rest of it. Now, for other people, they say, how can you work with sexual abuse? That's something I never could do. But knowing our own limits really helps us understand when to build in more support or when to take more time for ourselves. And then giving yourself some grace around, I'm trying to change how I'm doing things, that's going to take me some time, I think is also really important.
Yeah, and we had a question in the comments about we were given advice like maybe for dealing with family members or couples, and okay, so how do we translate that to somebody who lives alone, for instance, or maybe it's a single parent dealing with kids? And I think the point there is not necessarily that it's just a spouse connection thing. It could be coworkers, it could be whoever, but being aware of kind of building your support network. Who can you talk to? Who can be a good active listener? But also not unloading on somebody and also trying to be that for someone else, not trying to be the fixer. Whether you're talking about a spouse or a coworker, really kind of the same concepts of, ideally build your network, if you will, of people that you found are good listeners and try to give that back to them as well, whether it be at work or a friendship or a family member that you communicate with.
Ellen, one of the things I think about is because I lived alone for a couple of different periods in my life, and think about who would you call at 2 o'clock in the morning if your car broke down and you needed rescued? Who would come pick you up? And that's the kind of people in your sort of intimate circle, those people you can really rely on. Who would you call if you needed a ride to work for some reason? Those are sometimes the people that you can talk to about harder stuff. And at work, it really is about sorting people who have the same sort of knowledge and approach as you do about how to address these things. And if you don't have those people, sometimes even reaching out to people in other agencies. I know when I was running the Sex Offender Management Board, we sometimes had a probation officer in a local community that was the only probation officer in that community that dealt with sex offenders. Everybody else did something like, simple theft and destruction of property or tagging. And So they didn't really have people in their office who understood, but they would reach out and call other people who worked with the sex offender group in other communities when they needed to connect, or call my office when they needed to do that. And we always had somebody available to help debrief something, or listen, or just offer suggestions if that's what they needed. So think about building a support network that's based on what you need, but it may not be the person sitting next to you, or if you're living alone, it may not be the person in your house. It may be that you need to reach out in different ways. Many of us had to learn how to reach out in different ways during the pandemic recently. I know that I did a lot of social connection and support sort of unofficially by being at meetings and staying after for a little while and talking with someone, or going for coffee, or going out to lunch, or planning going out to dinner, or having a drink somewhere later. But I had to do it much more intentionally when I was online all the time, and not in a room where I could just step away and talk to somebody for a while. So think about, how do you build support networks depending on what your needs are, and depending on the reality of the people available to you here, or do you need to reach out a little farther and expand that social circle?
Well, and that goes to the tool there, proactively cultivate positive connections. Maybe you feel like you have no support. Maybe that's not something you have right now, but you can't necessarily just wait and expect it to come to you. You may have to be proactive and find those connections and reach out. And I know that sounds challenging, but again, it's kind of up to you to find that, whether it be through a coworker, a peer, or taking part in some sort of social activity that maybe you hadn't been doing.
And if you're someone who is a single parent, think about, are there nights you could build in a pizza night for you and the kids with another single parent, and the kids get to watch something on TV they like, and you get to sit in the other room and talk to the other single parent. I mean, I know that that's happened in my world, both with people who were single parents, but also with people who were periodically single parents. For instance, I had a colleague whose spouse had to go to India and work for a whole year, and he got one trip home. And she found herself being a single parent all of a sudden, and had to really think differently about how she got support for that. So I think part of it is just that reality about identifying for ourselves how it affects us, and then getting creative or asking other people, how have you dealt with this? You're a single parent who looks like you're not stressed all the time. I feel like I'm going to pull my hair out every day. How do you do it? What do you build in that makes it easier? And sometimes people offer really great suggestions about that. So thinking about doing that sort of outreach and how you might find those people is going to be something that can be a really strong coping tool.
Okay, so let's move to, sorry, my slide's not moving. Bear with me just a moment. I'm frozen.
Okay, we can do that. Would you like? Oh, but there you got it. It
Did it
came
move?
through. It came
Okay,
through.
gotcha.
That's always fun, isn't it? When the
It happens.
technology is
So
stuck.
when we talk about using tools, how do we reset it? You know, so part of it is just identifying what it is that's bothering you and kind of recognizing the behavior in yourself. And then you can kind of, you know, work towards finding tools to change that. So one of the things that I found that worked exceptionally well in my agency, when I took over the Internet Crimes Against Children, or ICAC task force, or the computer crimes unit at my agency, and I became the leader of the team, one of the things that I had really noticed over the last several years was that we just focused too much on how hard our job was. And we talked a lot about how, oh, it's so hard. Nobody else would want to do this. You know, it's terrible. And I found that what really worked for me was to celebrate our successes. So instead of talking about how hard things were all the time, and that's not to say that they got easy, I said, let's really try to focus on our wins. And let's talk more about what we got right than what we got wrong. Not to say we're, avoiding anything, but I found that when we focused more on our successes, whether they were big ones or little ones, that seemed to kind of make the rest of things more bearable. The idea is to be resilient and to be able to handle issues, whatever you're dealing with. But when you can focus on the positive and you let the positive be what motivates you to move forward, by identifying those good things that happened in the day, then it does make you more resilient and more able to bounce back from the harder things. And then also just how do you communicate with people? How do you having this positive communication and it sounds kind of rosy, but it's true. If you can focus on the positive things that have happened and let that be what you talk the most about, you're going to find that significantly enhances your mood.
Alan, an easy way to focus on the positives is to decide to thank someone when they do something well. It's really easy now. When I started doing this work a million years ago, because I'm kind of old, you had to get out a note card and an envelope and find a stamp and send somebody a thank you note through the mail. But you could text somebody a thank you. You could send a thank you note directly through the email. You could call and thank someone, or you could send a note to their supervisor. And you know how that feels when you get to make somebody feel really good? And sometimes it's something little, like you did such a great job asking that child questions. I hadn't seen him talk to anybody else before, and he responded, "Thank you for doing that." Or, "I can't believe the mother answered your question. She's been really resistant. You did a wonderful job with that. Thank you so much." Or, "This report made it really easy for me to understand what I was going to have to do when I did an intake with this family. Thank you." Those things are very simple, but they make the first person you're sending it to feel good. And it makes you feel good because it made them feel good. And it's a focus on something positive. So there are ways you can do that that aren't just, I'm going to say the good things, or I'm going to write a gratitude journal, and I don't really want to do this. But you can really find things in the world that are positive and good and helpful. And another thing is connecting with animals is also helpful too, and connecting with nature sometimes, because sometimes we can see something in the beautiful tree that's blooming, or the flowers, or the grass greening up, that feels good to us. And if we let that in, that can help mitigate some of the other negative feelings. The same way animals regulate our blood pressure and our heart rate. And usually the animals we're interacting with are our pets, and so they make us feel good too. So there are other ways you can sort of break up that negative response and start to feel more open to being positive or letting support in.
And Gene, I don't want to get too far into a management school because that's not what we're teaching today. But I will say this: you touched on it with complimenting somebody, or recognizing, hey, you did a really good job with that. Something that I found as I progressed in my career was, I think a lot of us maybe have this feeling that, well, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. Well, what I found was when I really took the time to notice and appreciate the good job that other people did and to thank them, that also helped me to put trust in them to do that job the next time. And, we always hear advice is to delegate. And that's not to say you're putting your work off, but sometimes it's hard to allow someone else to do it because you don't allow yourself to trust that they can do it. So by focusing on how well somebody does a job and thanking them, you're also kind of reaffirming, you know what, it's okay to trust other people to do things. I don't have to carry the full weight myself. So from a personal perspective, I found that one of the greatest things that I ever did as a manager was to empower other people to do the job that I thought maybe I could do the best. And what I often found was they did a fantastic job, did things that I wouldn't have even thought of. And then because I was the boss, they made me look like a hero. So again, not trying to stray too far into management techniques, but it kind of relates to the stress reduction thing, whether you're talking about a boss subordinate situation or just a coworker or a friend. If you can relax and take that moment to appreciate others, it's also going to give you confidence and share the jobs. So we're going to move to grounding techniques, and Jean, you're going to pick it up from there.
I am. I just wanted to know, someone wrote in the chat that they had concerns about sharing with trusted people because they didn't believe the person would remain trusted for very long. And when they were no longer trusted, they were afraid they might share that information. And when we have those kinds of fears, they can either be grounded in our worldview and how our worldview has been impacted by our work. And that's our next webinar. So I would really suggest that might be a place to look for some answers about that. The other thing might be to think about whether that is some previous experience that you had that was painful that may be impacting your ability to trust currently. And it may or may not be deserved, but thinking about grounding is pulling us out of negative history so we can be present in the here and now. So whether what you're worrying about or thinking about is case material or somebody who betrayed you in the past and that's impacting your ability to trust anyone to help now, or whether it's I have to do everything myself, which is a worldview impact, and you're trying to let other people do things, grounding before you decide what to do next can be really helpful because grounding puts us in the present, in the here and now, and takes us out of those sort of places where we're using past experiences or traumatic material to inform our thinking. So what we're really doing when we do that is figuring out how to anchor ourselves in the here and now that's not currently traumatic, where we're not currently being betrayed, where we're not currently in danger, and where other people aren't all jerks or some other expletive you might use to identify them who are untrustworthy. So we're going to go through a grounding exercise, and Alan does a great job with doing this. It is really about, remember that a lot of the way trauma is stored is sensory. So it is about making sure all of your sensory experience is in the here and now, where you are now, not in past trauma, past bad experience, or other things.
So I'm going to give you an example. We have a lot of different grounding exercises, and this is one I'll share with you that is actually something that helps me go to sleep. I am the kind of person that if I am really stressed or, if I have a lot of things on my mind, then I may go to bed at night and I might lay there for 2 hours with my head spinning about what I didn't get done that day or what I could have done better or whatever it might be. And I'm not going to tell you that I always get this perfect. Like I said, it may be 2 hours before I remember to do it, but when I remember this exercise, it actually works exceptionally well. And for me, it's not only something that could calm me during the day, but it's especially effective at helping me go to sleep at night. So I want you to follow along with me and start by placing your hand over your heart and then close your eyes. Really try to focus on your heartbeat. As you're focusing on your heartbeat, taking a deep breath. Hold it. 5 counts. And then exhale. Wait about 5 beats and repeat. Now, as you're doing that, really focus on the heartbeat. Feel it. Try to hear it. With me, I mentioned that I use this sometimes to go to sleep. I have a little thing that I'll do that's not on the slide, but I'll just share it with you. I have a clock in my room that's a digital clock, so it just changes once a minute. I will try to relax, feel my heartbeat, become very conscious and aware of it. And then whenever the clock changes, I'll count my pulse. And it's 1 minute before that clock's going to change again. And I have to really focus. And I'll make note of what my pulse is at the 1 minute. And then I keep counting with the idea that my pulse is going to be lower by minute 2. I can tell you I've rarely ever made it to minute 2. Definitely never make it to minute 3. If I really focus on this and allow myself to ground, then whatever it was that was distracting me it just tends to go out of my mind, and that focus on the heartbeat pulls me back to center.
That's a great description. I love that, Alan. And I love that it puts you to sleep.
It's one of the few things that work sometimes.
That's such a good thing. And that's part of these trainings is really thinking about, well, that sounds like that would work for me. Or I'll try this not just once, but a few times, because new things are uncomfortable often. And we need to, if you think back to some of the other trainings we've done where we talked about neuroplasticity, we need to practice it before it becomes something that feels like how it would normally feel if we were doing it well. But trying different things and see what fits for you and what works. And if it doesn't work after a while, you can let it go and try a different thing. Because for all of us, different tools might work differently. And this is one that is that deep belly breathing. It is another way to stop the stress chemicals and to kind of get back in the here and now. So you want to place one hand on your belly below your rib cage, because if you're breathing deeply enough to stop that chemical dump from the trauma and the stress you're having, your belly should move when you breathe, not just your chest. And so you're going to put the other hand on your chest and take a deep breath in through your nose. And your belly should move a little bit to be able to push your hand a little on your belly. And then you exhale through your mouth. Actually blow it out. And if you do this between 3 and 10 times, you can actually stop some of those stress chemicals and reset yourself enough to not feel like you're spinning in that stressful place that we can get to at times. The research says pretty clearly that if you do 5 full deep belly breaths where your hand moved on your belly, not just on your chest, you're going to stop that negative chemical dump. And that can be a great stress reducer for us just in the moment. And you can do this almost anywhere. I do deep breathing on the stand sometimes if I'm being attacked. I don't do the hand thing on the stand, but you could do this on scene somewhere. You could do this, just the idea that you practice deep breathing and know that that can take you out of a stress response quickly and easily is really powerful.
And Gene, you mentioned being on the witness stand. I know I've done this before. If you have attorneys firing off questions at you, it's their goal is to speak faster and maybe to get you to be in a hurry so you're not careful of what you say. And I have found that I've made it a practice, no matter what it is that I'm about to say, even if it's just an answer to a basic question, I'll take a breath first. I'll breathe before I answer that question. And I find that relaxes me and allows me to give a more coherent response and to not get caught up in that stress.
That makes all kinds of sense. Well, and here's another one that is gonna, again, get your senses focused on the here and now and stop you focusing on what the negative experience you're having is. So think about what fabric you're wearing. I mean, literally touch it. Like my jacket is a very soft smooth fabric, and my pants are much heavier and feel really different. If you have a sweater on or a sweatshirt, that's going to feel different. But touch it and think about it, how it feels, and think about how you sense that with your fingers as you're touching it, and what kind of feeling you have when you're thinking about that. You are literally right in the here and now, right touching what you're wearing. You can touch things around you as well, but something that you have on, again, you can do that anywhere, anytime, and very subtly to settle yourself down, get yourself kind of back in the here and now.
Great example, Gene. And I know we're going to throw a lot at you, but the thing is, not everything works the same for everyone. So we're going to present you with several different techniques, and we would encourage you to experiment with all of them and find what works for you. So, for instance, something else that's actually a pretty popular one, letting an ice cube slowly melt in your hand. Now, my first thought of that is, wow, that's too cold. But if you're focused on that ice cube, you're going to be distracted from whatever else it was that was really making your head spin or distracting you. So that's kind of the idea, whether it's focusing on your heart or grounding yourself by touching the fabric and thinking about the texture, or feeling the coolness of the ice cube and, feeling the water drip as it melts. If you focus on that, at least I know for me, I'm pretty much a focus on one thing at a time kind of person. But if you find yourself focused on whatever it is that you're using as the grounding exercise, you're not going to be so distracted by whatever else it is that is making you feel stressed or, overly excited about something.
That makes sense, Alan. And the ice cube, because it's cold, is a little more intense of a sensory experience. So if you're somebody who can touch your jeans and still be having your head spinning, then the ice cube might be for you, because it's harder to ignore when it's something that's really unfamiliar like that, like holding an ice cube and that cold in your hand. So we're going to go back to talking about connection. And I know there were a number of different comments and questions in the chat about connection. And this is some of the way we think about it. Just a reminder, and I know you may have heard this if you've been to all of these, but the strongest predictor, bar anything else, of people who are resilient and when they're exposed to any kind of trauma in any setting. So whether you're the helper or the victim or the person who has to come in afterwards, a person who reads the case file, whatever your role and however you're exposed, the strongest predictor of resilience, that is people who do well and don't have long-term negative impacts, is the presence and use of social support, the ability to connect with other people and feel connected to them and feel supported by them. And I want to remind you also that a healthy support system is not one person. It is finding someone who understands your work and who you feel you can connect with and talk to about that work. And as I said, that may be somebody in your office or your agency, or it may be somebody you make a broader connection with because they have an ability to understand you in a way that feels more supportive or that is more consistent with the kind of work that you do. It may be somebody who sits right next to you, who you partner with on cases, or it may be somebody who is actually in another city or town, doesn't matter, but that you have someone you can connect with in that way, that you have intimate others who you feel you can trust and talk to. So if you're a single parent, that may be more challenging. It may be some of your extended family, or it may be some close friend, or it may be another single parent who you build a relationship with over time. I know when I moved the last time, I had neighbors who I knew and felt really close to and connected to. I am still friends with those neighbors, but it didn't feel the same to me. And I really had to develop some new relationships with my new neighbors in my community, which I was able to do. And now I have very close friends who are neighbors across the street who I really trust. And I know other people and I say hello to them, but I have some people who are not in my family and not in my work who I connect with and feel good about connecting with. So a healthy support system has work support, intimate others, whether that's your family or your very close friends that picks you up at 2 o'clock in the morning if your car broke down, and people who don't know you in either of those contexts. Alan, you have often talked to me about how important your Sunday school class has been in that, developing that for you.
Yeah, and we'll skip to that slide. We've got about 20 minutes left, so we're going to touch on communication techniques, and in particular outside of work. And as Jean mentioned, I've found that for me, one of the most grounding things and one of the most stress relieving things is to have a life outside of work. And in particularly, one of the great blessings in my life, I've been part of an adult Sunday school class. I've been one of the leaders of the class for about a decade now. And, I spent 3 decades in law enforcement, but about 10 years ago, I got involved with a Sunday school class. And as it happened, there was no one else in the class that had any connection to law enforcement. And that was the absolute best thing for me. My class has plumbers and school teachers and a guidance counselor and 2 guys that worked in the IT department for Lowe's Hardware and, just people who have completely different perspectives. And what I have found is that um, having a life outside of my job and hearing them discuss the things that happen in their world really help give me perspective and help remind me of what normal is. Um, I do think there's a danger in only surrounding yourself with people who do the same work and only having work life. By having these other experiences and hearing how my friends how they react to things in the news that maybe is different than the way I would react because of my perspective, I've just found that really helps me a great deal to keep, just to keep life normal. So that's what I can offer is if you don't have a life outside of work, even though that may seem hard to do, I really encourage you to find social activities or some kind of structure that has nothing to do with your employer.
I think that's so true, Alan. It's another way to have consistent support. If you do something that has a regular meeting time, like I have been in the same book group and women's spirituality group over almost 40 years now. And those people know me really well and are a really strong part of my support system, um, even though they didn't start out as people I knew well when I first joined those groups. So I think that can be really powerful. And sometimes that's the way we connect is to use those things we're interested in or hobbies we have or a faith practice we have or any of those things can be the way into building some relationships, common interests. Um, I also garden and I have some really good friends who are gardeners, and it's something we share and it's really fun. And it's a way to focus on something that's not related to the work I do at all. It's really, really helpful.
All right, so that brings us to a great poll question. What is something that you used to do? And notice the phrasing there. A lot of us had hobbies and things that we used to do that we got too busy and didn't find time for anymore. But if you don't mind, put in the chat some things that you used to do that maybe you could see yourself getting back into if you had the time.
Painting and scrapbooking and baking and weight training. Wow, people are just biking, rollerblading. I used to rollerblade. I can't right now because of one of my hips, but I really, really love rollerblading. Swimming, reading, fishing, vacations, playing with my dog, singing in a choir, hiking, Wow.
Now, we're setting you up for something here because we're asking you what's something you used to do. And next, Gene's going to give you a little challenge.
Figure out a way that whatever you wrote in the chat, you can reconnect with in some way. Talk about happy memories of doing that activity. Contact somebody who you did it with and call them and say, remember when we used to go hiking together, or when we used to rollerblade, or are you still going to that Bible study at church, or whatever it is that you're putting in here. Really start focusing on how it made you feel and what the good memories are. And think about what gets in your way of doing that again. And we often tell ourselves, I'm too busy. I have too many other responsibilities. I've got work to do. I've got chores to do. But the reality is, we're going to have a stronger, better life if we give as much attention to doing at least some taking care of ourselves, and not just ignore that we have needs that need to be met as well. So how can you reconnect with that used to? Maybe you're not going to take a 3-week vacation and go to a mountain lake and camp and fish for 3 weeks, but maybe there's a river or a lake that's within an hour's drive of your house, and you can spend a little time fishing with somebody who is willing to drive up with you for half a day on the weekend. Or maybe it's something that you can think about, wow, I could put this in my schedule and do it one day after work, like going to work out. You don't have to do it every day. It's like, I'm going to add this one activity a week for now. And you might end up liking it so much that you keep it and have more fun when you do that. So think about adding back in something you used to do that made you happy, that you really enjoyed, because that's a way that's easier than starting a brand new activity. You know something about how to do it, and you probably know some people you did it with or who might do it with you.
Yeah, that's really, it's about relearning to have fun. If you find that you're too busy to have fun, then you've got to re-engage in the hobby, or even if it's just go down and take a walk, whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be running a marathon. You can walk a mile, but re-engage in the hobby or re-engage in whatever it was that used to be fun, or maybe even discover something new. Gene?
Teamwork is one of those things that really makes a difference. And I have been incredibly fortunate in my life to have teams in different places where I had strong support and people willing to practice working on vicarious or secondary trauma. And in some of those places, there were big barriers too. When I was a therapist, we insisted on having outside clinical supervision and meeting every week to review cases and provide each other support. And we addressed vicarious trauma when we did that. Other people in the hospital initially started calling us prima donnas and said we thought we were more important than other people. But within a couple of years, they were doing some of the things we were doing to ensure that they were getting support, good support as well. And think about ways you can do that both in the team and outside of the team. I know that when we started building in our case reviews, that everybody came not just with their problem case, which is what people usually came with, but with one at least minor success or positive outcome. It doesn't have to be the tail end of a big case. It can be, I've figured out how to get this resource for this family and it made a big difference for them. But you bring something positive as well as something negative you need to work on. That made a difference. When we started doing check-ins that said, hey, we're going to ask how your cases are doing. We're going to ask how you're doing. What are you noticing that's going well for you, and what are you noticing that's stressful for you? That made a difference. So there are things you can do, and you can build them in sort of natural ways. I know one of the things that happens often in our ICAT commands is after a search warrant, where they have to do some really stressful things, they often go out to breakfast or lunch together so that they can just connect and decompress a little. So think about ways you can build that in. At the hospital, if they were baking cookies for the day, we'd often go after a certain time of our clients that we saw and take 10 minutes and have a warm cookie together from the kitchen. You know, it doesn't have to be a big amount of time. And Ellen, I know that you had some guys who built some really great things into their workday that really shifted things for people.
Yeah, and I'll give you a couple examples, but something that comes to mind is that I feel like sometimes the examples we're giving, I feel like I need to put the asterisk, they're pre-COVID. And that's really just added to the stress level. When we think about our used to do this before COVID, used to do this, so that's been a change for us. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't kind of touch on that. But so I'm going to give you a pre-COVID activity and actually kind of how it came back up today. One of the things that I absolutely love is auto racing. And I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but for me, I really do. And I like different types. I like Formula One racing and NASCAR racing and whatever it might be. But that translated into an interest in go-kart racing. So a few years ago, I felt like my team at work was especially stressed out. So I found a venue where we could go and rent go-karts and race. And we scheduled a lunch. We did this over off-duty time, if you will, but we scheduled like a lunch, and it was a place that actually had food available. And we planned a go-kart race, and that's a completely different side of people than what you normally see in the office. Of course, you'd be amazed at just how competitive some of your coworkers are. That in itself is fun to discover, but it's something that we ended up doing several times because it was incredibly stress relieving. It was completely outside the scope of work. And like I said, it gave us a different perspective on some of the people. The quiet young lady down the hall that you didn't necessarily think was athletic turned out to be just a really amazing driver who could outrun all of us, that kind of thing. So that was a lot of fun for us. And it kind of got to be known as our thing that my team did. And I mentioned that because that was been a while ago. Of course, COVID came and that complicated things because we were using an indoor track, so they actually shut down for a while. But the reason I mention that is on a personal level, I've been dealing with some pretty big stuff lately, and I have some major life decisions that I have to make. And I have a good friend that I used to work with that was one of my team who checks in on me every now and then. And he actually called me today and said, "Hey, you know what? I understand you've been kind of stressed lately with some of the stuff you're dealing with. Why don't we get together and go-kart racing?" And I couldn't help but laugh because that was the tool that I used to help relieve stress for my team. And word got to one of my old team members that I was dealing with some big stuff. And he actually calls me up today and says, let's go to the go-kart track. I know it's not for everyone, but I've seen some great things in the chat. Somebody mentioned like rollerblading. I know, Gene, that was one of your things that you used to do a lot of. Rollerblading, going for a walk, and my family, something that is a family activity. Of course, I have two sons who are teenagers, so yes, we've also been go-kart racing. But for my family, it was riding bicycles or just going for a walk. And a couple of nights ago, my wife could tell that I was especially stressed, and she's a school teacher, so she has to bring papers home to grade. She has no time in the evening whatsoever. But I said, I really need to go for a walk down by the river. And she said, let's go, because she recognized that it would be a great time for us to go for a walk. And we ended up laughing and just really having a good time. But it's, whatever it is that works for you, you got to find that thing or that combination of things. But it's not just knowing what it is. It's the actual, as I say, getting off the couch and doing it. Make yourself do that activity, whether it's something that you used to do or something that's new to you. it takes your mind off that what's, you know, that's stressing you, and helps kind of get you back under control. And you know, as far as your behavioral stress, the things that if you find that your behavior is being affected, that you're more irritable or whatever, you know, some of these grounding techniques and stress reduction things that we're talking about can really help you get back on track. So in that note, let's go to questions. Frozen again. Give it just a moment here.
It's okay because the poll's already up. So you have a poll question.
Okay.
How do you apply the information from this webinar in your work? What is one new thing you might be able to apply to deal with behavioral stress? Whether that's maybe setting an alarm to make sure you go eat, or whether it is walking down the hall to check in with somebody, or whether it's what you do outside of work to relax that allows you to pay more attention to work. That's all you need to focus on in the poll. And, you know, one of the things that's real for all of us is setbacks in this happen. I mean, Alan said sometimes it takes him 2 hours of laying awake ruminating about what he's worried about before he remembers to do the grounding exercise. Sometimes it is, I remembered to do it for 5 days in a row and then I forgot for 3. But that doesn't mean I quit. That means when I remember again, I'll do it again. It means I'll give myself credit and grace when I forget, because we have setbacks. Things don't go smoothly. We always have this plan that we're going to get this, and this done. And I've learned in my life that if I didn't get to everything on my list, if I look, sometimes that's because something else came up, and I'll write it on my list and check it off. So I can't say I did nothing today. You know, those setbacks happen for us. And we want to kind of wind up with a quote that I think is really helpful to us. There's your visual for the setbacks piece. And I know you've seen that before, so we don't need to sit on that for very long. But this is about meaningfulness. When many things are difficult for us, if we are committed because we're doing something we want to do, or it's important to us, or we value the work we're doing, we can learn how to cope differently. We can make an effort and learn how to connect with people differently so we don't carry all this home all the time. And that's really what we want, is to offer you some options for how to have a less stressful work life and life.
All right, so kind of touching on some of the things we talked about today. Of course, we discussed briefly secondary trauma and traumatic stress, which we've covered in previous lessons. Talked about some of the ways the body responds to trauma. Today, we talked about behavioral signs and symptoms of traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, and talked a little bit about resilience and some tools and techniques to cope. And I can see in the chat that a lot of you were absolutely paying attention, and you know, I see things like the grounding exercises and breathing exercises that you're reflecting in the chat. So I just want to say that means a lot to us. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate that you're taking in what we're telling you. And if you have any questions, and Basilia,
Thank you so much, everyone. I just wanted to mention that we're running a little short on time, so we don't have any additional time for questions, but I did drop the link in the chat, so feel free to register for the Q&A session if you do have some additional questions, and feel free to visit OJJDP's website for upcoming webinars. But feel free to contact us as well. Here's our contact information. Feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions.
Yeah, and I've noticed several people talked about getting in touch with us. I know you can reach me on LinkedIn. Just look for Alan Flora on LinkedIn. That's usually the easiest way to find me.
And I'm open to anything you need to reach out about.
And here's our upcoming session. The next session will be on the 20th for Worldview, and this will be the last session for our Trauma Series webinar. And as I mentioned, feel free to access any of the past webinars on the website, and I'll pass it along to Alicia.
Thank you so much. Basilia, if you could put that registration link for the Q&A in the chat one more time. I think it may have gotten lost in all of the poll questions that were being asked, so I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Not a problem.
So thank you all for joining us today. We're going to wrap up. I have a few more things to go over. There is a poll question that Jean had mentioned earlier, just in closing, about how you would be able to apply this information in your work. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out, we would very much appreciate it. The link to the previous webinars is a part of the presentation materials. The Google link to download those materials was in the chat. You will be receiving a certificate of attendance via email. This comes directly from WebEx. So please make sure to check your spam folder if you don't see it. Here is our contact information. If you do have any questions about the materials or the recording, please send us an email. You can also subscribe to our newsletter and the JuveJust for upcoming events announcements. If you have any training or technical assistance needs, please feel free to enter in a request through the TTA 360 system. Again, past recordings can be found on OJJDP's YouTube channel or their multimedia page through their website. And this is a link to register for the final session in this webinar series. That is next Wednesday. We also have some upcoming events related to OJJDP solicitations. There are two coming up, one at the end of April and one at the beginning of May. Towards the end of April, we also have these two webinars coming up with our partner organization, PBS Standards, and then also through the Preventing Youth Hate Crimes and Bullying Initiative. And then our partners at the Innocent Justice Foundation who brought us this lovely series will also be holding two more webinars in June and July on the importance of optimism and purpose and sleep and well-being. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll put that link to the materials in the chat one more time, and you can stay connected with us via social media at any of these links. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you.